You know, there are some names that just echo through history. Names that feel more like legends than actual places. And maybe none is more legendary than Troy, a city right at the heart of what might just be the greatest war story ever told.
For thousands of years, that one name has been tied to this incredible story of gods, of heroes, and a truly devastating war. But you have to wonder, behind all that myth, was there a real city? Was there a real war? And that's the big question we're going to try and unravel today.
So, to even begin to understand the search for Troy, we first have to get a handle on the story that made it famous in the first place. This is a story that was, for centuries, the very bedrock of an entire civilization.
And that story is the Iliad. It's literally the oldest piece of Western literature that we have, and it's credited to a poet we call Homer. Now, what's so wild about Homer is that we know almost nothing about him. We're not even 100% sure he was a real person. He's this total mystery, a kind of ghost who left us with the greatest war story of all time.
And what kicks off this gigantic, world-changing war? A love story of all things. You've got Prince Paris of Troy, who visits Sparta, meets the beautiful queen Helen, and they fall for each other. They run off together, back to Troy. In response, Helen's husband gets his brother, King Agamemnon, and they launch this massive fleet, over 1,000 ships just to get her back. An entire war for one person.
But here's something you might not know. The Iliad doesn't actually cover all 10 years of the war. Nope, it zooms in on a really specific, really human moment. The rage of Achilles, the greatest warrior the Greeks had. His feud with his own king, and his final, tragic showdown with Hector, the heroic prince and defender of Troy. That's the real heart of the whole epic.
Now, for the ancient Greeks, this was history. It was real. But as the centuries rolled on, especially as we got into the modern era, people started to see the Iliad as, well, just a story. A powerful one for sure, a foundational myth, but just a myth. The gods, the heroes, the city itself, everyone just figured it was all the product of some poet's amazing imagination.
But what if it wasn't just a myth? This question leads us to one particular man whose entire life was driven by a single burning obsession, proving that Homer's Troy was real.
This guy's name was Heinrich Schliemann. The story goes that when he was just 7 years old, he saw a picture of Troy in flames, and that was it. He was totally hooked. He spent the rest of his life becoming a millionaire, learning languages, and get this, memorizing the Iliad, all so that one day he could pay for his own expedition. And in 1870, he shows up at this hill in Turkey called Hizarlik, holding his copy of the Iliad like it's a treasure map, and he just starts digging.
Now, Schliemann arrived at Hizarlik with, let's just say, a lot more enthusiasm than actual archaeological training. He was so convinced he knew where Homer's city was that he was more than willing to just blast right through anything and any layer of history that he thought was in his way.
But what he found wasn't so simple. He didn't just dig down and find one city. No, the mound at Hizarlik was like a giant layer cake of history. It had the ruins of at least 10 different cities, all built, destroyed, and then rebuilt, one right on top of the other, for thousands of years. So the real question wasn't just finding Troy, it was finding the right Troy.
After decades of much more careful study by actual archaeologists, the choices have pretty much been narrowed down to two main layers. On the one hand, you have Troy 6. The dates are perfect, late Bronze Age, and it had these incredible sloping walls that sound exactly like what Homer described. But it looks like it was destroyed by an earthquake, not a war. Then you've got Troy 7A. It's not quite as impressive, but it was clearly destroyed in a massive fire, and there's all this evidence of a siege. That lines up perfectly with the legend.
Still, even with these amazing finds, there was one huge, nagging problem. The citadel, the main fortress that Schliemann had found, it just seemed, well, small. Could this really be the legendary city that 1,000 ships sailed halfway across the world to attack? It just didn't seem big enough to be the prize in a 10-year war. And for a long, long time, this cast a lot of doubt on the whole thing.
For decades, that doubt just lingered in the air. But then, a modern archaeological discovery came along that completely flipped our understanding of the site. And it finally made the epic scale of Homer's story make sense.
The year was 1988, and everything was about to change. Using new technologies like magnetic imaging, archaeologists could finally see what was under the ground without actually having to dig, and what they saw was an absolute game changer.
They found a massive defensive ditch and fortifications way outside the citadel walls they already knew about. This meant Troy wasn't just a small fortress on a hill. It was the center of a huge lower city that spread out all around it. All of a sudden, the city of Troy was 10 times bigger than anyone had ever thought. This wasn't a fort, it was a metropolis.
This discovery just changed all the math. The estimated population shot up to maybe as many as 10,000 people. And suddenly, the city archaeologists were looking at was finally big enough to match the epic story. That was a city worth fighting a 10-year war over.
So why was this city so important? Well, you just have to look at a map. Troy sat right at the mouth of the Hellespont, this super strategic waterway that connects the Aegean and the Black Seas. If you controlled Troy, you controlled all the shipping, all the trade. It was an unbelievably valuable piece of real estate, a perfect reason for a huge war, and maybe a little more realistic than just a runaway queen.
Okay, so we found the city. We have a real motive for a war. But why, after 3,000 years, are we still so obsessed with this story? What is it about Troy that still matters so much?
Well, for the ancient Greeks, the Trojan War was their defining story. It was a source of shared history, a shared identity that brought them all together. But it didn't stop with them. The Romans, in a really brilliant move, basically co-opted the myth for themselves, claiming that they were the descendants of the Trojans who had escaped the city when it fell.
And this wasn't just some casual thing. The poet Virgil wrote the Aeneid, which became Rome's national epic, and it's all about the Trojan hero Aeneas escaping the burning city to go found a new nation. I mean, think about this. Some of the most powerful people in history tied themselves to this story. Alexander the Great said he was a descendant of the Greek hero Achilles. Julius Caesar's family claimed they were directly descended from the Trojan hero Aeneas. So, here's the bottom line. Because of our cultural inheritance from Greece and then from Rome, Western civilization basically traces its origin story all the way back to the burning walls of Troy. We are, in a very real cultural sense, all descendants of this one epic conflict.
Which, of course, brings us all the way back to our first question. We know now, for a fact, that the city of Troy was real. The story that Homer told about it is, without a doubt, immortal. But what about the war itself? Did a Greek army really lay siege to this city for 10 years?
You know, ultimately we might never know for sure. As one scholar famously put it, belief or disbelief in the historicity of the Trojan War is, in the end, an act of faith. And maybe that's the way it's supposed to be, leaving just a little bit of mystery at the very heart of our oldest and greatest story.